Why so serious?
I have something I need to get off my chest. The Joker 2 is actually good. Wait. Hear me out. I promise I'm not insane. I may be a contrarian, but I have my reasons. Before I continue, there's a couple things that I need to make clear. Number one, I'm about to spoil the entire movie. I don't do spoiler-free reviews because that's cringe. Number two, I'm writing the script immediately after seeing this movie and I've only seen it once, so I might forget some stuff, I might get a couple things wrong, but I'm only human, so sorry in advance. And number three, there's like no footage available for this movie, so I don't know what'll be on screen. I don't know, maybe I'll put some Injustice 2 mobile gameplay up or some shit. We'll see, I might have to get a little creative. With all that out of the way, let's talk about the first one. Sorry, there's some very necessary context that needs to be put in place in order for me to get my point across. In case you haven't guessed by now, I think the first movie is amazing. It's a masterfully crafted movie on every front. It's well paced, perfectly acted, it looks great, the story is engaging, there's hard-hitting moments. It's a really solid movie. But as I've always said, this movie isn't really about the Joker as we know him. It's doing its own thing. It's OC. And I'm totally fine with that. Now, there have been lots of versions of this character, and he can vary wildly from story to story. But there's a couple things that I need out of a Joker for him to be the classic Batman villain we all know. Number one, ambiguity. In my opinion, knowing Joker's backstory makes him a lot less interesting. The mystery around a character as chaotic as the Joker is very important for keeping him intriguing and intimidating. You know, unstoppable force and all that jazz. And that leads right into number two. He needs to be irredeemable. The audience can't sympathize with him at all, or the character falls apart at the seams, at least as a Batman villain. A prime example of these two things is, of course, The Dark Knight's Joker. Heath Ledger's version of this character is also very different from most comic versions of the character, but he has the core tenets. He gives a different backstory for his scars to every person he talks to, and we never learn where the fuck he came from. He's just a force of nature who appears at random. And of course, he's completely irredeemable. His whole purpose in The Dark Knight is to make Batman falter, to question himself, to betray his morals. He doesn't care about money or even power, but his utter dedication to his task, as nonsensical as it is, makes him really intimidating. On top of all that, he's incredibly intelligent and calculated despite his dedication to creating utter chaos. And so even though Heath Ledger is completely doing his own thing, we still see him as the Joker. This does not apply to Arthur Fleck. The movie breaks that first rule instantly. We get his name, we see his life, his mother, there's zero ambiguity. It also breaks the second rule. We feel bad for him and actively root for him the entire movie, even when he's being a terrible person. For all intents and purposes, Arthur Fleck isn't the Joker, at least not the one we know. Now this really pisses some people off. This movie sucks, he's not even the Joker. Who cares? The character is still interesting and the movie is still good. But that does create an interesting problem. Problem that I've been aware of since the announcement of a second movie being made. You told the origin story, you had the epic climax, where do you go now? I've made it pretty clear that this version of the character wouldn't work as a Batman villain. He isn't some criminal mastermind, none of the events from the first movie were planned by him, so what do you do? How do you tell a story with this version of the character that follows up on the first movie in a satisfying way? You don't. And Todd Phillips knew that. So the Jonkler 2 Revenge of the Fallen doesn't really have a story. Okay, I know that sounds bad, but hear me out. The way Joker 2 is structured is interesting. It's far from perfect, but there's a lot of really interesting and creative ideas at play. For one, this movie takes place entirely in two locations. Arkham Asylum and the courthouse, where Arthur is involved in a very public trial as a result of all the one pumps he got last match.
360. Let's go. Let's go, headshot!
And one thing I quickly realized when watching this movie is that Arthur is pretty much reset to his factory settings at the beginning of the movie. We see his mundane daily routine in the asylum, and we see the guards asking him to tell a joke over and over again, but he never does. He just shuffles around blankly. No expression, no laughter, nothing. And at first, this confused the hell out of me. Why isn't he the Joker anymore? Wasn't that the whole point of the last movie? Well, no. Not according to this one at least, because this movie turns everything you remember from the last one on its head. But that'll make more sense later. Very early on, he meets Harley, another patient at the asylum, in a music class. She's drawn to him immediately, as she already knows who he is, so she tells a tragic backstory about her childhood abuse, and talks about how she was committed for burning down her apartment building. She says she loves what he did, that she's seen the TV movie they made about him 20 times, and for the first time in the movie, we see Arthur open up. He listens to her shitty joke and actually laughs for the first time in the movie. The rest of the movie is essentially Arthur getting high on the attention that Harley, the rest of the inmates, and the public give him during his trial. While he initially attends court as Arthur Fleck, he eventually fires his lawyer and represents himself, where he's then allowed to attend as the Joker, where his attitude and stature changes immediately. But something is still off. He doesn't have the commanding presence he had in the last movie. He does weird accents and says a bunch of nonsensical shit, but he's not convincing. He's faking it. This is interesting because the entire trial rests on the idea that the Joker is an alternate personality. His defense is based around an insanity plea, and to the audience, he isn't doing a very good job of showing the world that he's insane. The whole movie is basically Arthur going to court, him and Harley singing a love song, him going back to Arkham and seeing the other patient's reaction to the trial, and that's it. But in those moments, we see Arthur's delusion and the way the public reacts to it, which changes significantly by the end of the movie. But then, something terrible happens. Right when Arthur is at the peak of his delusion, riding the high of his fame, he gets raped. YouTube, please don't take my video down. Yeah, seriously, the guards actually rape Arthur. Now, I think this comes completely out of nowhere, but the aftermath is actually very interesting, so we'll talk about that later when I get to the problems with the movie, because let me be clear, there are problems. After this, his delusion is shattered. He goes to court the next day dressed as the Joker, but he breaks down. He admits that he didn't kill those people because he had some bone to pick with society. He killed those people because they were bullies. It wasn't for a cause. It was a mentally ill man getting simple revenge. He even admits to killing his mother, something the public wasn't aware of, which shows how personal the killings were to him. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the public and Harley are meant to represent the two different perspectives of the audience. When Arthur admits this, Harley feels betrayed, so she loses interest in him and completely abandons him. And the public, who largely still believes in the character of the Joker, blows up the courthouse to free him, but all he does in the end is get taken back to Arkham after a brief chat on the Joker stairs. No escape, no great plan. He just goes to talk to Harley, the only person who he believed actually cared for him. And I love this scene on the stairs because it represents the title of the movie, Breaking Apart. The French subtitle, which I'm not about to pronounce, means Madness for Two, which essentially highlights the shared delusion between the two of them. For the whole movie, they sing these songs together on the set of a late-night show, on the set of a Broadway rooftop, in a nightclub. Their delusions fuel the relationship. And when Arthur wakes up from the delusion and talks to her on the stairs, she starts singing. But this time, he doesn't. All he says is, "Please stop singing, I just want to talk, please, no more singing." The delusion is broken, and Harley wants nothing to do with him. This is aimed at the audience. This movie questions the audience for creating this narrative around the character in the first place. The idea that he was some kind of anti-hero that was fighting against societal oppression when in reality, he was just getting revenge, killing his bullies. And when this narrative that the audience created was shown to be false, they turned on the movie entirely. This is almost certainly a direct response to the way people talked about the first movie. Some people think Arthur Fleck is some kind of anti-hero, and some reject the movie entirely because it wasn't what they felt the Joker should be. This movie states that both of those groups are wrong, and the last scene all but says it out loud. After Arthur is apprehended and taken back to Arkham, another patient stops him in the hallway. He's giggling and smiling uncontrollably. He asks Arthur if he can tell him a joke, and Arthur agrees. He tells the joke, ending it with the famous, "You get what you fucking deserve" line, before stabbing Arthur repeatedly. As he falls to the ground, bleeding out on the floor, we see the other patient cutting a smile into his mouth in the background. This was the moment where it all made sense. Now, a lot of people on the internet hate this ending, but I don't. I think it fucking rocks. This ending works on two different fronts. As far as the narrative goes, it vindicates the sentiment that I always held, that this isn't the Joker. Now, I didn't realize it would be this literal, but I love the idea that this crazy person who was thrust into the limelight and championed as almost a vigilante was just inspiration for the real character, the unstoppable force. And this movie shows us that Arthur isn't this person. He's very stupid, he's manipulated incredibly easily, and he acts rashly with absolutely no thought of the consequences. He's no criminal mastermind, and certainly no Batman villain. And the other reason this ending works is because it practically breaks the fourth wall without any words. This is the director staring the audience in the eyes and telling us to stop comparing Arthur Fleck to Heath Ledger's Joker, because they're separate entities entirely. I love this ending because it not only contextualizes the movie we just watched as far as explaining his lack of Joker-like behavior, it also recontextualizes the first movie in a very interesting way. That's what I mean when I say it turns the first movie on its head, because this ending makes you watch that movie very differently. It's not a Joker origin, it's the origin of the Joker's inspiration, and that lines up with what I've always said about the first one, because even at the end of the first one, he's still a little pathetic. He stumbled his way into his infamy, and it was basically an accident. And so the delusion slowly fading after he's locked up makes sense. The climax of the first movie almost comes off as a manic episode, and it takes Harley to feed his delusion in order to put him back in that mindset, but only temporarily. And my favorite thing about this movie is that it defied my expectations. I was convinced that this movie would suck, that there was no meaningful story to tell, that a sequel to such a climactic and satisfying film was pointless, but it wasn't, because they went in a direction I could have never expected, and I have to respect that. Now, I know I just said a lot of nice stuff about this movie, but as I've said, this movie has some serious problems. It's far from perfect. For one, this movie is kind of boring. It really drags at times, and I feel like they could have used the runtime more effectively. There's a lot of scenes of Arthur just sitting around and talking to the guards or going through his morning routine or court scenes early on that don't really contribute much to the narrative. They could have trimmed a lot of that down and the movie would be better for it. And even though the movie looks great, is shot well, has great atmosphere and good performances, I have to wonder where the fuck $200 million went. The movie consists of 3 locations: Arkham, the courthouse, and establishing shots between Arkham and the courthouse. Oh, and the funny Jonkler stairs, but that's not even a set, so I'm genuinely just lost on where the budget went. My only guess is that Joaquin and Gaga got a bag, and whatever was left went into the production itself. Another big point of contention leading up to the release of this movie was the musical aspect, and I was one of the people who really didn't like this idea, mainly because I thought it could compromise the tone of the first film. But honestly, this movie isn't a musical, like at all. When I think of a musical, I think of a story told through music. The narrative and the characters are pushed forward through the music. That is not how I would describe this movie at all. The musical numbers are essentially a way to showcase delusion, which is a major theme of this movie. When Arthur or Harley or Arthur and Harley are singing, it shows that they are caught up in the delusion, and on its own, I think that makes for really effective juxtaposition between Arthur's mind and the real world. It does a great job at showing the headspace he's in. With that being said, I think the musical numbers are still kind of a miss. For one, Joaquin is not a very good singer, or at least his vocal performance is really weird, and having to compare his performance to Lady Gaga makes it that much worse. There's also way too many musical numbers. If they wanted to have this many, they needed to commit harder to the movie being an actual musical, because the music never really changes or develops as the plot progresses, and none of the music is original. I also think they should have gone much more fantastical with the visuals and the vocals during these sections. If you want to emphasize how deep the delusion has gotten, it needs to be really over the top, and a couple of the scenes are, but not most of them. And if they wanted to solve the issue of Joaquin having a bad singing voice, they should have just replaced his voice entirely, made it super stylized, make it sound nothing like him on purpose. Something like that could have helped the music make a little more sense. Overall, I think the musical sections are effective at getting their point across and demonstrating the mindset of Arthur and Harley, but they don't really work for the usual intended purpose of a musical number, and they serve to bog the movie down in a lot of instances. Another thing that isn't totally effective is the relationship between Arthur and Harley. Now, at first, I really didn't like this version of Harley. I've said that I think wild changes to the source material can be effective, but I didn't really agree with the decision to make her a patient at Arkham. But then I did a 180 when they revealed that the whole backstory she told him was fake, and that she was actually a psychologist with 2 very successful and very alive parents. The idea that she has the same backstory as the classic version of the character, but doesn't go crazy because the Joker drove her to it, and instead is an obsessed fan who admitted herself to Arkham to get closer to him, is a really creative idea, and once again, works really, really well for an audience surrogate. The biggest issue I have is how rushed their relationship is. It does make sense that Arthur would get attached to her immediately, as he's never felt love in his life, but I just think we would have benefited a lot from seeing them together more. Most of their scenes are just small talk or singing, which doesn't really give us much insight into their relationship. I also wish we saw a little more context behind Harley's obsession with him. We never learn where her obsession comes from, which makes her complete devotion to him a little underwhelming. I would have liked to see some scenes of her life that maybe demonstrate why she feels this connection. Okay, let's talk about the rape scene. This scene was utterly baffling to me, if I'm being honest. I think what they were going for was the idea that even after he became the Joker, the system still oppressed him, which shattered the illusion of power he had over it. In a vacuum, that's a really good idea. The problem is that it doesn't feel natural at all. If I remember correctly, he's in the courthouse and he says something along the lines of, "Those guards are fat and gay," I'm paraphrasing. And the guards just drag him into the bathroom and go to town. Off screen, thankfully. It was very out of place because we spent a lot of time with the guards throughout the movie. They aren't great to him, but they actually occasionally show him kindness, and the times when they are assholes, it makes sense because Arthur killed 5 people and is also crazy. If they showed the guards being cruel the entire movie, maybe I could buy it, but then that would destroy Arthur's delusion too early in the story. So instead, they have the guards seem pretty normal, and then upon being called fat, they rape him. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's even dumber because they already have the Gary scene in the courthouse where he basically destroys Arthur's entire perception of himself. He expresses how Arthur was the only person at his job who was nice to him, who didn't make fun of him, and how he's utterly terrified of him now. Arthur tries to keep his walls up by claiming that he spared him so there should be no problem, but this doesn't really work. He realizes that he became the same oppressive force that he got revenge on. This works really well as a catalyst for the facade fading, but instead, it's just supplementary to the scene with the guards. But even with the flaws it has, this movie is just so damn creative with how it follows up the first one. It makes some really grand statements on the audience's perception of the movie and character, while also fitting very nicely within the confines of the narrative that the first movie set up. It subverts your expectations of what a sequel should be at every turn, taking an incredibly unique approach to the structure of the movie. It's almost nothing like the first one, and yet it enhances it. And while I do think the first is a better movie, I couldn't have asked for a better follow-up, because the movie shouldn't have a follow-up unless it has something new and interesting to say, which this one did. Now maybe you hate this movie, and you think I'm a shill, and honestly, that's fair. It takes a lot of big swings, and it does miss quite a bit. And a lot of the things that I found interesting and enjoyable really might not appeal to a lot of people, and that's okay too. But I just can't help but enjoy how bold of an approach they took to a sequel for a movie that was already so divisive amongst fans. Also, Joaquin Phoenix isn't Jared Leto, so he gets bonus points for that no matter what.
I don't want no beef.
You want no beef? You don't want no beef? You don't want no beef?